Are the Falcons telling us that they're not in it to win it by not pursuing Lamar Jackson? We'll break it all down on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the most humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. It's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube. If you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, get us over 5,000 subscribers, then you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And make sure you check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app. So today, guys, we are revisiting the Lamar Jackson conversation. Later in the episode, we'll probably touch upon Calvin Ridley and sort of the statements he shared about his, mental health struggles over the last 2 years. And the gambling suspension and what led to that towards the end of the show. But we'll talk a little bit about Lamar and the conversation around the Falcons not pursuing him. And I'll apologize in advance if today's episode is a little bit more meandery. It's owed to the idea that talking about this situation and the Falcons quarterback situation in general is like a 4-hour conversation, and it's just kind of hard to condense all my thoughts into one podcast, and so I have to kind of pick and choose, so it may go off in different places. But a lot of this stems from having listened to other people that a lot of them I respect that cover the NFL as a whole kind of talk about this Lamar Jackson situation and talk about the Falcons specifically kind of botching this in terms of not pursuing Lamar Jackson, because it's been a widely opined opinion. That's the right word. It's been widely opined over the last several months that, a lot of people would love to see Lamar Jackson in Atlanta. Like Atlanta was the place that they would love to see that sort of situation. And the Falcons being among, the first teams to be like, we're out on Lamar Jackson, I think was disappointing to a lot of people. And that's led to a lot of criticism, particularly from some national writers. And I do want to talk a little bit about this notion that I heard one particular person say, that if you're not pursuing Lamar Jackson, your team is not interested in winning. And I think my initial reaction to that was seemed a little harsh, but I kind of look back at it in a different way after considering a different way, and I'm like, okay, maybe that's a fair criticism, but we'll get to that in a second. But I do want to talk a little bit about why the Falcons aren't pursuing Lamar Jackson, if that still is not clear. Again, some people would tell you it's because they don't want to win and they're incompetent. But I still think at the heart of this issue, and this is something I've brought up before on the podcast, which is this is a labor issue. This is a proxy war between the NFL and the NFLPA. And I won't say Lamar Jackson's in the middle of it, because he's definitely on one side. He's not, a victim in this by any means. He's out here, because he's representing himself. He's the one pushing for, getting that fully guaranteed contract. And I've heard many people say, Lamar Jackson's good, pay him whatever he wants and prosper. And I just feel like that's such a kind of dismissive and lacks nuance approach to this whole situation. And I just feel like, while I am a person that believes in, players securing the bag and getting paid as much money, so I am not rooting against Lamar Jackson getting his fully guaranteed contract, even if me being in, putting on my Terry Fontenot sized bald cap, and, becoming the general manager of the Falcons and being reluctant to give him that, I do applaud him for making that move. But at the same time, I don't think it's as simple as, well, all these teams are owned by billionaires, they can afford it, so give them the money. I think that's just a dismissive and overly simplified way of looking at that whole situation. But one of the things that in thinking about, is a team like the Falcons, against winning? They don't want to win, right? By not pursuing Lamar Jackson, by not at least giving him a phone call. And again, I would push back against that notion just because we found out today that league rules mean that you're not allowed to contact franchise players until the league year actually starts on Wednesday. So that's part of it. And so it is possible that the Falcons could be like, oh, we will pursue Lamar Jackson next week, but we'll see. But looking back at the whole notion of teams not wanting to win, and I was like, that's not fair. But then I looked at the Falcons schedule, the 2023 schedule, and I was looking at it with the idea of, what's a realistic win total for this football team? And it's obviously it's early March. There's a lot that's going to happen between now and the start of the season. So don't take what I'm about to say and etch it in stone and say this is what the Falcons record is definitely going to be. A lot can happen between now and then. But sitting here today with the assumption that the Falcons will at least have a competent defense this year, and I look at the schedule and I look at, how many games can they realistically win with Desmond Ridder, and sitting here today without knowing what any of these teams are actually going to look like, just guessing, I kind of came up with a floor of like 6 wins and a ceiling of probably 9 wins for this team. So a team that's probably hovering around 500 this year with Desmond Ridder as their starter. And then I looked at this schedule with the same parameters with an improved defense and Lamar Jackson. And I came with a very conservative figure, which was like a floor of like 10 wins and like a ceiling of like 14, even though like I kind of looked at the schedule and I was like, it's probably like 12 to 15, if I'm being completely honest. And it's like, whatever the difference is, it's like 5 to 6 wins, right? Let's say it's 6 wins, that you're 6 wins better with Lamar Jackson. And from that perspective, the whole notion of teams, like the Falcons, by not even contacting Lamar, are allergic or aren't interested in winning. From that perspective, that was like a bitter pill to swallow, right? It was like, oh, you're turning down 6 potential. We'll emphasize regular season wins this season by not trying to pursue Lamar Jackson. And whether you think that amount of wins is worth the price that you would have to pay is up to the individual, but I would imagine a lot of people would say, yeah, it is worth, 6 wins in the regular season is very hard to come by, and the potential to be a postseason team, immediately is something that is worth, giving up draft picks and guaranteed money for. And I would not particularly disagree with that. But at the end of the day, I do think this issue is bigger than just simply, hey, if you want to win, go get Lamar Jackson. And if you don't get Lamar Jackson, you don't want to win. I think at the heart of it, it's a labor issue. It's and by labor issue, again, I mean, players want guaranteed contracts, and owners, for obvious reasons, don't want to give them guaranteed contracts. And coaches and general managers, while they can advocate for the players, ultimately work for the owners. So whether it was Arthur Blank going into Terry Fontenot's office and saying, we're not interested in Lamar Jackson, or they just kind of know, like, we know, right? We know how this works. And there didn't have to be any sort of paperwork or trail of text messages to get collusion going or anything like that. It just, we'll sort of see how it all gets resolved. But one of the things that's going to be interesting to watch over the next 6 months is if any of the other quarterbacks join him in solidarity. And I'm referring to Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, Jalen Hurts, all guys that are probably due to get big extensions over the next 6 to 12 months. And we'll see if any of those guys with actual representation rather than representing themselves, that representation will advocate for, bigger, fully guaranteed contracts to try to move. Because if it's just Lamar, I think, it's going to be hard for him to win that fight by himself. But if you get, 3 out of the, 5 or 6 top young quarterbacks in the NFL, to join you in that fight, then it's a potential movement, and that will be certainly an interesting conversation to be had for in the future. But we will continue today's episode digging a little bit deeper on why the Falcons may be keener to build around Desmond Ridder as a correction from past mistakes, and we'll talk about how people tend to talk about quarterbacks, and the relationship to team success may need to change a little bit as we continue today's episode. But first, guys, I want to tell you about Built Bar. Everybody's trying to eat a little bit healthier this time of year, and if you're like me and you want to eat healthy and not compromise on taste, Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. They're covered in 100% real chocolate. They have great macros, like only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, but a whopping 17 grams of protein. And you can head on over to built.com and find limited time flavors. But now is also the time where you can head on over to your local Walmart or Sam's Club and find Built Bars. That's right. Walk into your local Walmart, walk to the pharmacy section and grab yourself a 4-bar box of your preferred flavors like cookies and cream and double chocolate. Or if you're in Sam's, run in and grab a 13-bar box of peanut butter brownie and coconut almond. You will thank me later. So continuing today's episode, talking a little bit more about the Lamar Jackson situation. And we talked a lot about Lamar Jackson over the last 2 months. We did a bunch of episodes in the middle of January talking about that. And, my conclusion then was I would not personally, again, putting on my bald cap, because I have so much hair, to pretend to be Terry Fontenot. Probably had to trim the facial hair as well to put that Halloween costume on, which is an idea. But I was against the idea of trading for Lamar, but I would understand it if the Falcons did it, given the immediate boost, the immediate shot in the arm that we just described that you would get. But part of the reason why I was against the idea of trading for Lamar was mostly due to the draft capital that you would have to give up. That before it seemed like you were almost certainly going to have to give up at least 5 draft assets, and now you're only stuck with giving up 2. And while I'm not necessarily huge on giving Lamar Jackson a fully guaranteed $250 million contract, I certainly would argue that the Falcons, relative to a lot of other potential suitors for Lamar, are better positioned to handle that type of contract, at least in the first few years. In large part due to the fact that they're probably not going to pay, other than Chris Lindstrom and we'll see about Caleb McGarry and AJ Terrell, they're not going to pay a ton of guys from their 2019 and 2020 draft classes. So they're not going to need to hand out a bunch of big contracts in the next couple of years. However, once we get to probably the 22 draft class, this past year's draft class, hopefully a pretty good 23 draft class, when those guys are coming up for their new contracts, in like year 3, year 4 of a 5-year contract with Lamar Jackson, I think that could be a little bit more problematic, where the team will have to make some hard choices about, who to keep and who can't keep. But it at least theoretically gives you like a 2 to 3 year window where you can potentially try to win it all. And, it meshes with the stat that, what is the stat? Like, if a coach doesn't win a Super Bowl in the first 5 years, he never will, with like, I think Bill Cowher and Andy Reid being the 2 exceptions to that. And I think that notion of trying to win it all in the next 2 or 3 years makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. It's like, why wouldn't you do that? Especially people on the national media stage. But that is not as attractive to me personally as it might be to others. Just because, I'm very familiar with the last 15 years of the Falcons, because that's basically what they were trying to do with Matt Ryan. And it's funny to me how unpopular Thomas Dimitroff was, especially towards the end. But essentially, if Terry Fontenot as his replacement adopted basically the same philosophy, it would basically be like, you know what? TD actually had it right. He just picked the wrong quarterback. If they were to do all the same things with Lamar Jackson that they tried to do with Matt Ryan. And I know some people out there would certainly agree that, the main issue that the Falcons had was their quarterback. And I don't think that's the majority of people. I think the majority of people would look at those supporting cast. And that's what's been fascinating to me with the conversation over the last several months about the team sticking with Desmond Ridder, or riding with Desmond Ridder, as some people would say, because a lot of people always sort of combine those two statements with "I would stick with Ridder and building up the rest of the team." Right? It's the idea of the resources that you would spend in upgrading the quarterback, or resources that would be better served building up the rest of the roster. And I think that notion often butts heads with how a lot of national media people perceive, these types of conversations, because while we all agree it's a quarterback driven league, I do think there is a tendency among some folks in national media to basically put way too much on the quarterback, right? And basically say it's all the quarterback and nothing else. And I think that's easy to do when when you watch a player like Patrick Mahomes and the dominance that he has had in this league the last 5 years. And it's interesting to me because, like, I kind of feel like Mahomes is going to be the new Tom Brady, in the sense of, like, for the next 10 plus years, he may be the exception to all the rules, similar to how Tom Brady has been the exception to all the rules for the last 20 years. And I think another part of it is we've seen teams recently be successful going out there and getting their quarterback. The 2020 Bucks doing it with Brady, the 2020 Rams doing it with Stafford. And we saw a lot of teams try to replicate that same thing this past year, with the Broncos going after Russell Wilson, the Browns going after Deshaun Watson, the Colts going after Matt Ryan, and it not necessarily working. And I can't help but part of the reason, not the only reason, it may not have worked for those teams that did it in 22 versus the Bucks and Rams in 20 and 21 is the Bucks and Rams paid a lower figure for acquiring Brady and Stafford, at least from a price tag standpoint. Obviously, the Rams gave up a lot of draft capital for Matt Stafford, right? And I think that enhances their ability to surround those guys with better talent than maybe what some of those other teams were able to do. I also think that that 2020 Bucks team and that 2021 Rams team had sort of a special ingredient, that allowed them to be, a Super Bowl contending team, right? And I think with the Bucks, that was Tom Brady. And I think with the Rams, that was Sean McVay, one of probably the top 3 offensive minds in football, right? And I've always believed in the notion that Super Bowl caliber teams always have some sort of special ingredient. There's something that they do better than pretty much everybody else in the league does. And I wonder, in a world where the Falcons go out and make this all-in move to win a Super Bowl with Lamar Jackson, what is their special ingredient? Is it Lamar Jackson? Is he, I think he's certainly special as a runner, but is he special in other ways, right? Is their special ingredient, in the same way that the Rams was with Sean McVay, Arthur Smith as a play caller? And, I think ultimately, regardless of who you want the Falcons to have at quarterback position, a lot of your hope and optimism in the direction that the team is going boils down to how you feel about Arthur Smith as a play caller. And I've seen and heard a lot of people clamor for Lamar Jackson in an Arthur Smith offense for the last couple of months. And maybe I'm just missing something, but I feel like Lamar in a Arthur Smith offense would be very similar to Lamar in a Greg Roman offense. And unless we're just really thinking, the bootleg rollout play action game is just going to just unlock a different tier of play from Lamar Jackson, I don't quite understand what is so intriguing about Lamar and the Arthur Smith offense compared to Greg Roman. But, maybe at a future date, I will get one of these people on the podcast that has been pushing for that to basically explain it to me. But I think, even if you're confident that Arthur Smith can get the most out of Lamar Jackson, you should probably be confident that he should get the most out of Desmond Ridder. You should, potentially be confident that he get the most out of, if the Falcons decide to draft a quarterback this year. And, what exactly is the most out of Desmond Ridder? It's up to the individual to decide. But, I do feel good about Desmond Ridder's, development and the potential. I think he can be a good quarterback, but probably not a great quarterback. But I kind of think Lamar Jackson is a good quarterback, but probably not a great quarterback either. And, currently, and, again, as controversial as this may sound to some, I think in 2 or 3 years, with development, it wouldn't shock me if we were looking at quarterback rankings, in 2025, 2026, and people have Desmond Ridder rated above Lamar Jackson at that point in his career. So, obviously time will tell on these issues. But like, as crazy as that may sound to some of you, I do think we tend to perceive quarterbacks in a poor way, right? Because I think what happens oftentimes is once a quarterback becomes good, we kind of retroactively backfill and pretend that he's been good, this good all the time. And like that is not true. And so I think that leads to people basically looking at where Desmond Ridder is today and thinking and projecting him, and thinking that there will be little to no growth from where he is today to where he could be tomorrow. And I think you look at top quarterbacks like Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, to me are perfect examples of this, because like people forget, just go rewind the clock a year and people were like, Jalen Hurts can't get it done in the postseason. Not to mention, even a year before that, it's like the Eagles are building around this guy, and of course, people forget how bad Josh Allen was like his first 2 years. He was bad, man. He was like legitimately bad. And then things changed. And like I feel like that Philadelphia, that Buffalo blueprint model, whatever you want to call it, is kind of what Atlanta is going for. And I feel like that is a much more sustainable model than what we've seen the Rams and Bucks do in recent years. As you see, both of those teams are set for a rebuild, right? And of course, I'm sure some people will say, well, that's owed to Tom Brady and Matt Stafford being as old as they are, on the wrong side of 30, and Lamar's only 26. But I also look back at the Falcons past, and when they made their all-in move back in the day to go get Julio Jones to put that team over the top, Matt Ryan was 26 at that time. And it didn't quite work. It got close, but it didn't quite work. And the Falcons were like those teams, within 3 years, tearing it down, firing their coach, and bringing in a brand new guy to kind of do a semi-rebuild. And I think that's why, as a fan who is certainly in it for the long haul, God willing, I would like to see this team build something a little bit more sustainable. I would love to see this team over the next, several years of this decade be considered one of the model franchises of this decade, similar to how a lot of people perceive the Bills, how a lot of people perceive the Eagles right now, rather than what they were over basically the final 7 years of the Matt Ryan era, which is constantly looking for that final piece to get them over the hump, which is, I think, just kind of, they're just going right back. It's just a regression to me in a lot of ways. Even if it is a progression on the football field, it's just a regression in terms of how the team does business. But that's kind of how I feel about it. Again, I'm not against the idea of the Falcons, trading for Lamar Jackson, as I said earlier, because we're not going to have to give up as much draft compensation. I'm much more open to it than I probably was a month or two ago. But we'll just sort of see how it all plays out with Lamar Jackson. We'll see how it plays out with the rest of these quarterbacks in the guaranteed contracts, and we'll see what happens with the Falcons and what their quarterback plans are this offseason. But we'll move on and wrap up today's episode with touching upon Calvin Ridley sort of speaking out and telling his side of the story from his stepping away from the game and mental health issues and the gambling stuff, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But if you want to get some insight into this year's quarterback class, by all means, you can do so by following the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. Subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts. So to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, let's touch briefly on the Calvin Ridley stuff. And for those of you that don't know, he wrote an article in the Players Tribune the other day, sort of kind of detailing his journey over the last couple of years, why he had to step away from the game, why he admittedly made the dumb decision to gamble and leading to a suspension, and why he feels like, he's back at it. And, I'll link to the article in the description below. I won't necessarily rehash all of it, because again, I would recommend all you guys read it. But, I thought, to me, the whole thing was, I was always critical of Calvin Ridley for what I perceived to be a dumb decision to gamble. Right. And he owned that mistake and admitted it was a stupid choice that he made. And however, I was never, ever, or I hope I wasn't, please tell me if I was, but I never tried to be critical of his choice to step away from the game. As someone who has dealt with sort of mental health issues in the past, and I'm sure many of you have also dealt with those issues, I thought it took an incredible amount of courage and bravery for him to sort of speak up, especially, given what he does for a living, and that tends to be, a suck it up and battle through it. And he kind of did that to a certain extent from a body injury standpoint, where he talked about how he played basically the second half of 2020 on a misdiagnosed broken foot, which, a testament to his ability. And he also talked about how when he initially sort of stepped away from the game, he got some funny looks from people in the building. There was like some people that were supportive of him and some people that weren't. But it's kind of basically like a cry for help. Like, I liken it to sort of a cry for help, and, to see people being like, no, it's like you're hanging off the edge of a cliff, right? And you're like, please help me up. You're kind of like, help me up. And then someone comes along and like, no, and they just kind of kick you in the face, and like, no, get up yourself. You'll figure it out, and just keeps on walking. And like, that to me is kind of the reaction that arguably some of the people in the building had. And, a small, I will say, minority of fans, at least based off of my interactions, fans had, talking about how he quit on the team. And, that was a whole saga in and of itself. But I'm glad he got, to say his piece. I'm hoping that this will cause a lot of those people that were, dismissive of his mental health issues and lacked empathy in that regard to look themselves in the mirror. My guess is, the type of person that would, be dismissive of Calvin Ridley in the first place is not the type of person that tends to look inwardly and self-assesses themselves. They probably think, they walk around with their stuff like their stuff doesn't stink. So, I doubt it's going to cause anybody to have any major changes of heart, but hopefully, the stigma against, situations like that, where, people have to take a break away from football, or life in general, we will continue to make progress with, that. And this will not be as big a stigma in the future as it has been in the past. So that will be progress that I would like to see. I don't have any additional thoughts on that. Always was rooting for the best of Calvin Ridley, big fan of him as a football player. And I hope he absolutely annihilates it in Jacksonville, just because I'm that type of person. I don't stop rooting for players just because they don't wear black and red anymore. But we'll see how that all goes, guys. We'll be back on Monday with a mock draft Monday. Yeah. So if you want to submit some questions to be answered as part of the Mailbag Monday, you can do so by hitting me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can leave a comment here on Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, or you can hit me up in the Discord, the Locked On Falcons Discord, the link in the description below. Go check out that Calvin Ridley article. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft, where hosts Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez of the Draft Network are giving you the in-depth looks at the top prospects, some sleepers, some hidden gems, all available in the same podcast feeds that you check out Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. Appreciate it, guys. Hope you have a great weekend. Till then.